Welcome back, everyone. I'm Reshmi Nair, anchor at CP24 here in Toronto, and I'm pleased to introduce our keynote guest today. Pierre Thomas is ABC News' senior justice correspondent. He's covered justice for over 20 years at ABC, and that means he has covered Democratic and Republican presidents, and of course, the last 4 years of Donald Trump, all along the way breaking news and picking up more than a few awards. I know he really was hoping to be here in person, but Pierre joins us today from the ABC studios in Washington. Welcome, Pierre.
Well, I'm honored to be with you and just so appreciate RTDNA and have great friends in Canada, including Fiona Conway, who is just a dear friend and colleague. And it's just a privilege to be with you today. I'm looking forward to the conversation, and hopefully I can answer whatever you can toss my way.
Yes, and a reminder for our guest, if you have any questions for Pierre, you're going to notice to the right of your screen, there's something called Meeting Pulse. So if you see the agenda there, you scroll down, you're going to find a tab for Q&A. Make sure you sign in there, and then you can type in your questions, see what others are asking, and then upvote your favorites for Pierre, and we will keep looking at those questions as we continue our discussion. And I want to talk about a lot of things here, Pierre. We want to talk about the year that was, right? It's about reckoning and recovery. And when you think about 2020, it started with a global pandemic, the most powerful nation in the world being led by a president, which turned out to be his last year as president for Donald Trump. And then in May, there was the murder of a Black man spread across social media and on traditional media as well. If we can start with the death of George Floyd, Pierre, through your lens, if you take us back to May 2020, what was that like for you?
Yeah, Reshmi, before I do that, let me just say one thing about the pandemic. I'm sure all of you and most of the people attending the conference virtually went through a similar feeling that I think I had. I was struck in the early days with this feeling that so many people were confined to their homes. And I don't know about you, but I felt a greater sense of responsibility because I felt like and could sense that people were watching us, reading us, listening to us in greater numbers than would be traditionally the case. And again, I felt a greater sense of responsibility, and also the notion of public service just kept creeping in my mind, that people were literally in their homes fighting to survive a new entity that suddenly surfaced. Think about it. In December, no one was worried about a virus literally killing them if they went out the door. And suddenly that was the situation we found ourselves in. And I just really felt like in the moment, I could feel it, and I don't know if many of my colleagues up there felt the same way, but it was something that struck me. And so when something like George Floyd happened, it literally traumatized a nation that was already traumatized. We were dealing with the pandemic. Again, a trip to the grocery store was not without risk. Going to do your live shot was not without some risk. No one quite knew how this was going to turn out. And I recall hearing about the George Floyd tape. And I'll be honest with you, for a moment, because I was engaged in other stories, I was reluctant to watch it. And then as the day wore on, it became very clear that this was going to be a law enforcement civil rights story that I was going to have to engage in on some level. Wasn't quite sure necessarily how I would have to engage. But the world witnessed a man literally being killed before their eyes. No ambiguity. It was right there, front and center. And for many African Americans, the issue of being treated differently by police was something that people of color have been saying for years, that the treatment that African Americans get when they're pulled over or when they're dealing with police can often be different. I use the phrase often, suspects first, citizens second. That's the feeling that many African Americans have when dealing with the police. They have the talk with their children about, be super careful in dealing with the police. And that is from both past history and recent history. So as cameras, iPhone cameras, smartphone cameras have become more ubiquitous, you're seeing more and more of these incidents. And many African Americans have basically been saying, I told you so. But not until George Floyd did you see, I think, the dramatic national change or shift in tone, because it was so horrible. And the casual nature in which the officer had his knee on the back of George Floyd's neck. And I described it on one of our broadcasts. It was as casual as if he was reading the newspaper, as that man pleaded for his life. It was stunning to have to cover. And as a journalist, I was reporting the facts, but also, again, I'm in my black skin every day, and I knew I could bring that perspective to the story as well. So that balancing act was something that we all needed to deal with, but it was both rewarding and tragic and heart-wrenching all in the same breath.
And it led to a greater rise of the movement Black Lives Matter. And here in Canada as well, Pierre, we had these conversations in our newsroom about how to handle that movement. And you had an interview with Attorney General Bill Barr, and you sat right across from him and asked him, do Black Lives matter?
I did indeed, because again, we have a highly polarized country. Everything is partisan. And the issue of Black Lives Matter and the organization is a subject of intense debate. And what I was trying to get to is to get a sense from the Attorney General, was he connecting at all with the issue itself? Forget the organization, with the issue. And I think in one of the questions in that interview was trying to get him to see if he would acknowledge the notion that Black people are treated differently than their white counterparts when in encounters with police. And I was somewhat surprised when he answered that question in a very fulsome way. But again, that's why we do the job, to question people in power, to get a sense of what they think and why they do what they do.
How do you prepare for an interview like that? And I mean, under the entire umbrella of justice in America right now, how do you prepare for those kinds of interviews?
Well, Reshmi, I think one of the things I try to do is put myself in the seat of people at home. And one of the basic things is, what do people at home expect me to ask? What would they want to know? What would my peers think that I should ask? But at its root, I look at the person I'm interviewing, think about them, I think about them in the moment, and I really try to design questions that they will actually answer. To me, there's no need to do a bunch of questions and that may seem dramatic or whatever if you're not getting any answers. Because again, we have to think about the people at home in these critical moments. They need and want answers. And that's the job. And that's I don't know if it's an old-fashioned point of view, but that's just basically my point of view, which is I'm trying to ask the questions that are in the moment important, and to allow the people at home to see how these people who are in positions of power, how do they actually think? How do they actually feel? And there's some level of trust going on with the people that you're interviewing. I did an exclusive with Bill Barr, and I think he was the first and only cabinet member to criticize President Trump, in an on the record, on camera interview that and live to tell about it. And there were some people that were thinking, well, was this a game that he was playing? But in the moment, he was under incredible pressure from the judicial system, because the president kept commenting on the Roger Stone case and some of these other cases. And Bill Barr was under tremendous pressure from within the department and from the judicial branch to basically try to get the president to stop talking so much about the ongoing cases. And I'll never forget that moment when he said, I can't do my job if you keep doing this. And again, who knew how the president was going to react to that? So those are some of the more exhilarating moments when you're doing these interviews. But again, the goal is to really get the person that you're interviewing to share something of value about a topic or a series of topics that one would think would matter to people at home.
Yeah, and that's interesting because it was Donald Trump on Twitter, right? How could any one of his cohorts, support most of the tweets that he was putting on social media? And I do want to talk to you about social media in this year of reckoning and recovery as well. But if we stay on BLM for just another moment, Pierre, in your newsroom, when you go to work, when there's something, when there's an issue that is so pressing that is the skin that you're in, how do you work with that?
Look, the one good thing about our profession is that we have certain principles that we need to apply every time, which is report the story, think about the story, try to get as many different perspectives as possible. And to be uncomfortable, is okay. To cover things that are uncomfortable is okay, as long as you're having thoughtful, intelligent conversations with the various platforms that you're dealing with. I know ABC News, we tried to cover the story as thoughtfully and aggressively and as fairly as we could, but we could sense that there was something unusual happening. I recently had the opportunity to interview Reverend Al Sharpton, who in this country is a leading civil rights leader. And he talked about the moments where he knew or came to understand that the George Floyd situation was perhaps different from some of the other horrendous cases that he had been, lobbying on behalf of the victims of. And he said two things that struck me. One, that initially he wasn't certain how much a difference the George Floyd case was going to make, that it was horrible when he saw it and he knew it was something he had to pay attention, but he just didn't want himself to get his hopes up that it was definitely going to be a difference in the movement and this issue. And he said he had gotten to Minnesota and he started noticing that the crowds were incredibly diverse. As he put it, a lot more white people in the crowd than he would have anticipated. And there's one moment when he's walking on the scene in Minnesota, and he said someone tugs on his jacket, his coat jacket. And he turns around and he said, there's a little girl there. She looked to be 12 to 13 years old, and she was white. And he said he initially had a feeling of trepidation. Oh, she's going to say something jarring. And she said something to the effect of no justice, no peace. And he was really, in his mind, heartened by that. And then he went to another location and he looked out into the crowd, and there was a significant number of white Americans in that crowd. And he said, something is changing. And it's something, he said, I don't know how much it's going to ultimately change, but he knew something was changing. And I think that was the thing about the George Floyd case, among others, but George Floyd's case in particular. I think it caused corporations in this country to look at the issue of race in terms of, hiring, promotions. I think it caused the country to basically stick a mirror up to its face and say, where are we? And how close are we really on this journey to equal justice under the law? We did a special in the days after George Floyd, and I was thinking, well, I'm going to do some analysis here, and I decided to go to the Lincoln Memorial, and we shot, in front of the reflecting pools, and I said, let me walk inside the Lincoln Memorial, and maybe that will inspire me to say something. I don't know what it's going to inspire me to say, but I'm going to look to camera after I'm done, and I'll say whatever's, comes to mind. Part of that story and the story of George Floyd was this notion that America's been on this journey to overcome its original sin, which is slavery, and the notion that certain people, don't deserve the rights, or certain people should be treated first as animals, I mean, the Constitution of the United States didn't define Black people as fully human initially. So there was a reckoning, and we're still on that journey, but no doubt the George Floyd story was one of the pivotal moments in my lifetime and certainly in last year.
And the mirror that you describe for Americans, for us in Canada as well, we saw that with the presidency of Donald Trump. Would you say that the last 4 years was a reflection of America having to look at themselves and ask themselves, who are we?
Well, this country is incredibly diverse, and the Republican and Democratic parties, increasingly, it feels like in covering the situation are in battle more than in conversation. And it's gotten so intense in terms of the rhetoric, to the point where we had a January 6th incident that was unlike anything I'd ever seen, where literally you had people storm the centerpiece of American democracy, fighting police officers. I'm interviewing officers who said it was like a medieval fight, with people frothing at the mouth, literally, some of them. I had the first interview with Officer Harry Dunn, a Capitol Police officer, who was mentioned in the impeachment trial in the Senate as having been called the N-word 15 times by the people who broke into the Capitol. And that interview still haunts me. I still am in contact with Officer Dunn from time to time just to check on him. But that was a man that witnessed something that he will never forget, that was traumatizing and hurtful. He described this moment where he'd been fighting all day, and he's sitting in the Capitol Rotunda, which is a grand, grand location. And there's trash on the floor, there's water bottles, there's this mist of tear gas. And he basically asked the question, is this America? And so these are all questions that the country is still grappling with. It's a hopeful country as we come out of the pandemic, as we all are, Canadians as well. Americans tend to be, hopeful even in the most difficult of circumstances. But no doubt this country has some serious challenges that we're all trying to cover and put in perspective.
And as you say, document the facts. That's our job. In that scenario, though, the Capitol Hill riots, the attack on January 6th, how do you find balance in telling that story as a Chief Justice correspondent?
Well, I have an allergy toward lies. I don't know if that's just a professional condition that I've developed. I don't like lies. And we saw, and I think we can say this without any reservation, what lies can do. January 6th was in part a manifestation of lies. The election was not stolen. The data does not suggest in any way that we had any meaningful, broad, massive voter fraud. There's just no evidence that there was broad, massive voter fraud. And yet you had a bunch of people who believed that there was, to the point where they came to the nation's capital and literally trashed Congress. Mm-hmm. They were chanting, "Let's hang the vice president." And so, in that way, it wasn't that difficult. Is that, what's the old phrase? Are you going to believe your lying eyes? I mean, we have the video. I've done the interviews. So this notion that this was some casual occurrence that is still out there on social media is crazy. It's just not true. And again, as journalists, I think we have to be resolute in presenting the facts. And when we've done these stories and we show the video and we interview the people that were impacted, that's doing our job. And ultimately, we all need to be very careful when there's an assault on truth. Look, the politicians can do political things. They're going to lobby their cases. They're going to make their points. Our job is to hold them accountable as to what their policies will actually do. But the issue of basic truth is something that we can be we can't afford to be unrelenting on.
When do you call a lie in your work, though? Newsrooms were quite hesitant. We used other words, untruths, not telling the truth. We came up with every word but lie when it came to some of the rhetoric coming out of that last president.
Yeah, I know that was a subject of some conversation. For me personally, I just do the stories. If you have a senator or a congressman saying, oh, this was a casual affair, you let them say it and they say, but there's this, and you show the video. I mean, I think we have, apparently one of the congressmen, and I can't think of the name right now, was talking about, this being not that bad. And then they actually found a photograph of the congressman helping to barricade a door from the mob. Right. So, again, that's the great thing about this job, that you get to just shed light and show the people what actually happened. And that's why we have to work really hard. Look, nobody wants to make mistakes. I think people, try to do our profession very well, but we should never be cavalier in pursuing facts and trying to be right as best we can. I'm not saying that scenarios where you're going to make a mistake. I'm saying that in these moments in particular, especially when you had so many people at home during the pandemic who we knew were watching, who we knew were reading us, who we knew were listening to us, that it was just important for us not to be the issue, us being the media and journalists. It was important just to tell these stories. And again, I think that at the end of the day, I trust the American public to make informed decisions if they're given, accurate, clear information. Now, people are going to go to different formats here, and some people go to reaffirm what they already think. We know this, but those of us, who do shows like World News Tonight or Good Morning America or Nightline or ABC News Radio, we're just trying to tell the story as directly, clearly, and as openly as we can, and then the people can decide for themselves.
The news cycle is quite fast and quick, and when you think about the daily news and what we're covering, and you bring up that interview that you had with the Capitol Hill officer, the follow-up, right? The recovery part of this reckoning and recovery is so important in journalism right now, to not just let that story go once the sun sets.
I agree, and I think the most important thing we can do, and often in these situations, is to humanize the story. What's the human story? And to have Harry Dunn trust me to help him tell his story, to lay out what it was like to be in that building. So he went from a nameless person mentioned during the Senate trial to a person you could see in his face and relive what he went through. And I just think that was incredibly enlightening for me. And it was a conversation because I felt like in order to get him to be fully himself, I had to be willing to share a little bit about my experiences as well, so that he could understand that it was a conversation and not just, your traditional interview. And, we had this new program called Soul of a Nation, which tried to really dig into and flesh out the African-American experience, the moment, in a way where the broader public and not just the African-American community could really sense and understand to some degree what African-Americans go through, particularly in that moment. Here he is protecting democracy over an election. And there, as I said, the issue of race seeped its way into that conversation, that moment as well.
Mm. And the humanity of this pandemic is something that newsrooms are always looking for as well, right? That personal story. But when you're dealing with a global pandemic and so many numbers, different names for variants, how do you narrow down the humanity of COVID-19?
Well, thankfully, We had a lot of colleagues who were willing to go out, be a part of the pandemic. We had at least one of my colleagues who contracted COVID during the course of the last year. And we were in the hospitals. We were talking to the nurses. We were talking to the doctors. We were talking to the patients. And more importantly, we were also talking to the people who had lost loved ones. And one of the things I want to commend journalists both in Canada and here for doing is keeping that story front and center for day after day, week after week, month after month. Because it's not the easiest story to do. It's not a fun story to do, but it was a critical story to do. Because the first job was to define, hey, America, hey, Canada, there's something truly lethal that has just injected itself into the American environment. And we needed to understand what it was. We needed to understand how it was operating. And we needed to tell the story of what was actually happening to people. And I mean, some of the stories that I saw, done by the print, some of the stories I saw done on television, on streaming, were just extraordinary in terms of bringing home how real and horrible the pandemic actually was. And we still ended up having debates about mask wearing and whether people should take the vaccine. But again, all we can do is just keep putting out the facts, keep putting out the information, and then people have to be their own judges to
And is your colleague recovered now?
what they
Good,
do.
good. Can you give us an idea of what it's like in your newsroom and other newsrooms that you've worked in? Well, maybe just for 2020 though. Did you see anything change within those debates or discussions?
Oh, well, many newsrooms were super quiet. Most of us did the bulk of our reporting. There was even production done from people's homes. I think it's fair to say that the news media, particularly the broadcast media, was as nimble and as creative as it's ever been because we couldn't gather. You couldn't have a busy newsroom during the pandemic. And so, I would walk into the bureau I'm in right now and maybe see 2 or 3 people, but we figured out a way to get it done. I did some live shots from my basement, initially. But over time, we wanted to give viewers at home as much normalcy so that they could see our anchors and our correspondents as they would normally see them, to give some sense of normalcy to them. And, I was really proud of all my colleagues, across different organizations, that people were really just trying to do the best job that they could do and explain this horrible, tragic pandemic.
We're getting some questions in from our participants. Thank you all for joining us as we have this conversation with Pierre Thomas, ABC News' Chief Justice Correspondent on the year that was. Reckoning and recovery is the theme. Pierre, what do you find are the most effective tools to help you be as fair and balanced as possible when covering a story that is traumatic or personal for you?
I mean, I think having access, talking to as many people as possible, working with and relying on my colleagues to collaborate in those moments. We did a lot of specials about the pandemic. I was able to do some work about missed signals, just trying to engage in the topic, even though, again, I'm not the medical reporter, but, I had some experience doing investigations. So we did a very, I think, strong Nightline program looking at mixed signals. Some of the early work I did was on digital, looking at travel patterns and how, if there ever was an example of how global travel affects our health, it was this pandemic. That we basically use customs data to show travel patterns, and you could see how the virus literally jumped continents in a matter of days before the world really knew what the heck was going on. And I found that very rewarding to work on that kind of story. So, it's just, to answer the question, it's just, relying on everything at my disposal, the people I'm interviewing, sources that I've developed, and colleagues to just pursue doing the story, so that when you go home that night, you feel like, hey, I did the best I could do.
Did you take any time off this past year?
A little time here and there, trying to maintain some sanity. My son was engaging in his high school senior year, virtual learning for all of it. So it was this kind of weird existence where I would spend the majority of the day reporting, writing from home, then come downtown and do live shots, or if we had special events, make my way in a little bit earlier. But there was a premium on safety and not spreading the virus. So it was just, everything was odd. Everything was sort of off kilter, to say the least. And
going back to your point when we first began this discussion about how we didn't know what was happening, but we knew a virus was en route. What were the most scariest moments for you during 2020?
I mean, I think just like everybody else, there was this moment, remember, where is it airborne? How long does it live on surfaces? And then we come to find out that the primary way it was being spread was through particles, that we emit as we have conversations. And it just required all of us to think about health. I would try to do a lot of the grocery shopping, for example, for my household, because I would go and do a Good Morning America live shot. And I said, oh, the grocery stores are not that busy right now. So off I throw on my gloves, throw on my mask, and there I was, shopping, incognito, trying to get the groceries for the family. So I think that was the part that was most unnerving, that something had happened that literally affected everybody on the planet. And the realization that, no, this wasn't for the other person, this was for all of us. And you couldn't escape the notion of it. I don't know if you felt that way as well, but there were certain points where the COVID virus was so prevalent that you knew if you went into a supermarket and there were 100 people in there, a percentage of those people likely had the virus and maybe didn't even know they had it. And that was the other thing that I think, to answer your question more directly, the notion that people were asymptomatic with the virus and spreading it was, I thought, the most evil aspect of this virus, that you could be spreading and not even know you were spreading it.
Yeah, absolutely. Here we went under lockdown for 2 weeks, and now it's been almost 16 months. So I remember those first 2 weeks, and we all just didn't know what was going to happen. So I hear you on that, Pierre. Another question coming in for you. You have been the Chief Justice Correspondent for ABC News for 20 years. So this could go past, well beyond 2020. What is the most difficult story you've had to tell, and why?
One thing about the beat, and I think we were talking off air just before we got started, is that the variety, mass shootings, terrorism, civil rights, business stories, antitrust stories, you never know what the story is going to be that could dominate the news cycle. Right now, we're in the midst of the cyber attacks, ransomware attacks in the United States. But I'll share a story with you guys in terms of 9/11. I just joined ABC News. I come over from CNN, and prior to CNN, I was a reporter at the Washington Post. So I lived a life of print and broadcasting now. And I happened to go to New York because I hadn't gone to New York to meet the brass, some of the news leadership. And I hadn't done that. So I went to New York, kid you not, on September 10th, 2001. And I remember being up there, and I had a series of meetings on the 10th, and there was a thunderstorm that night, and my then bureau chief, Robin Sproul, who went on the trip with me, said, it's going to be terrible weather. Who wants to be stuck at LaGuardia? Why don't we stay overnight and have dinner? The next morning, my mobile phone rang, and it was my wife who said, "Did you see that plane hit the World Trade Center?" And I said, "What? What are you talking about?" I was kind of getting a late start, and I immediately thought propeller plane, small plane, something like that. Next thing you know, I turn on the television, and literally I see this gaping hole, smoke, and I'm scrambling to get to our New York headquarters. Again, I'm based in Washington. I just happened to be there at the time. The next thing I know, I'm on the set with the legendary Peter Jennings. Again, we have great connections with Canada. He's from Canada originally, one of the iconic great journalists of our time and broadcasters. And he's getting to know me. I've been at ABC News all of about 9 months, and I'm getting information from sources, telling them what the FBI is doing. I remember reporting at one point that the most critical thing I'd been told was that the FBI was going to the airports to get the flight manifests of all the planes. And by that, they would figure out who were the culprits, who was behind this. And I remember Peter initially was a little bit skeptical and was questioning, but when he went off the air that night, he one of my more proud moments said, "And Pierre Thomas got this really interesting information. We now see the FBI all over these airports." And I remember that. But you recall that these people started showing up at the Trade Center site with pictures of their loved ones. And broadcast media in America was on the air constantly. There were no commercials during that week. It was constant coverage. And there were a couple of times when I eventually made my way back to Washington, that you would see these people showing up with their signs. "Have you seen so-and-so and so?" And it was heart-wrenching. It was horrible. And there were a couple of times when I felt like a tear welling up in my eye, and I immediately would just suppress it, because the viewers didn't need to see me crying when at that point I'd lost no one. I just was forcing myself to just tell the story, tell the story. And it wasn't until that Christmas Eve when I was sitting in the breakfast room of my home in Alexandria, and my wife had made pancakes, and it was a beautiful, Christmas Eve, and I'm sitting there, and I'd watched no television other than just report around that time frame of the attack. And the NFL had gotten relaunched at some point in the days after the 9/11 attack. And when they did relaunch, there were all these shows that were recording the planes flying over and people crying in the stands and saluting and all these different things. I had seen none of it. So on that particular morning, ESPN was running, one of those retrospective year-end pieces that they always do. And all of a sudden, tears were just flowing down my face, and I was just crying uncontrollably. And my wife walked in and said, "Is something wrong with the pancakes?" It was like, because she had no idea why I was just bawling and crying. But it was because I had tamped down all those emotions and had not allowed myself to grieve at all. Again, it wasn't about me at all, but it was just, that was just a really difficult story to have to cover, just because it required you to, at least me, to push down a lot of emotions. So that's probably one of them. Watching that George Floyd tape, obviously, was horrible. All the mass shootings, Newtown covering that. It's hard to single out any one, but those would be high on the list of really challenging stories to cover.
That suppression you speak of, Pierre, I'm sure every journalist identifies with what you're describing there, and finally finding that release. We talk about mental health more these days.
Mm-hmm.
How important is that for journalists, for people who absorb their surroundings and then deliver the stories?
Oh, I maybe am not the best person to ask, because I just keep grinding it out, as we say. But I think it's important to recognize every aspect of your life when you're doing these stories. And I dare say that some of the people who've gone to those hospitals, who covered the story of the pandemic, who maybe watched someone lose their life or talked to a family member, after they lost someone, I can't help but think that those people, wake up sometime or as they're driving, think about those things. And I guess it's like any other job. We don't want to, put too much emphasis on ourselves. We're taught not to, quite frankly. But I think that there are just certain moments when you have to understand that doing the job is going to require some sacrifice on all levels. And I don't know journalists that aren't hardworking. The people I know put in the work, put in the time, and sacrifice. I mean, for the Murrow Awards here in the U.S., I was asked to give some remarks about this past year. And one of the things I talked about was, the notion that journalism is public service, that it's required something of us all in a way in the past year. And I really believe that's true.
Is that what initially drew you into the industry?
Yeah, that I like learning new things, and I love to write. And I can recall the call to my mom. I was majoring in business at Virginia Tech, and computer science, and I was first generation college student in my family, and I said, "Mom, I'm going to switch to journalism, communications." And she said, "Well, how much does that pay?" And because for people who didn't have generations of people going to college, they thought the whole point of going to college was to get a good paying job. And I remember answering my mother and saying, "I'm not exactly sure, but if I work hard at it, I'm sure it'll be fine." And she said, "Well, okay, honey." and that was that. So.
That's a great piece of advice, as long as we all keep working hard at it. On the justice file, what is it about being the chief justice correspondent that keeps your passion going?
As I said a few minutes ago, just the variety of stories. These are stories that directly impact people. Many times they're the stories of our life. The civil rights story, the mass shooting. In America, if you think about this, when I do a story about mass shootings, I can't recall a single place that we used to hold dear and sacred that has not now been affected by mass shootings and gun violence. And so synagogues, the church, the Walmart, the supermarket, an elementary school. So my passion remains because the stories are just so consequential.
And when you're seeking or when you're interviewing someone, I want to go back to that Bill Barr interview. When you're interviewing someone of authority, for journalists listening in as well, how do you navigate an interview like that? Listening is key, but what other skills would you have in your back pocket to get through an interview that would last? I don't know, how long did you sit down with Bill Barr?
I think both those interviews were at least 35 to 40 minutes.
Yeah.
And, newsmakers don't often want to give you that much time. The less time for them, the better in some cases. The only bit of advice I would give in terms of interviews is try to spend some time thinking about your subject. Not about you, but your subject. Who are they? What's their take? And combine that with the moment. What's the most pressing issue of the moment that I need to engage this person on? And think about facilitating answers. How am I going to get answers to these pressing questions?
So now that you're under Joe Biden's presidency, have you noticed a difference in your work from Trump to Biden?
Well, the main difference is, look, Biden's not tweeting as often, but the issues are no less consequential in how he performs or not. There's an infrastructure bill. There's a pandemic he's still dealing with. There's the whole issue of police reform and whether the administration can move forward on that. There's this whole issue of voting rights. So consequential issues, differences in style, but our job is the same, is to press forward and cover these stories with vigor and aggression and balance.
Well, we really appreciate your insights, Pierre. If there was anything else that you could offer as advice for an up-and-coming journalist, I'm thinking someone new who's probably not making a lot of money, they're probably a freelancer, they probably have passions that they want to pitch to editors, but they don't know where to begin. What was your start like?
I think, as a young African-American, coming into the profession, didn't come from money, didn't come from, a family of any name to speak. The thing I would encourage all your journalists to do is say, why not me? Why not me? I can go out and cover the story. I can go out and be comfortable who I am covering the story. And to always remember, it's not about you, it's about the story. To be creative, to be thoughtful, and to try to, put as much energy into anything you're doing, be it a news brief to a documentary. And if you just kind of get in that mindset, I think everything typically will work out. But just to believe in themselves and to believe that this job, no matter what people tell you, has value. This job is important. Think about, again, the pandemic. We were giving people information at different points that would literally save their life. And it was that profound. And when we're covering the various stories, it could be the town hall, it could be, the prime minister, it could be whatever. To just this notion that conveying information to people so that they can make informed decisions is really, it's noble work. I mean, I know we get a lot of heat about bias and this, that, and the other, but this is noble work. You just need to decide to make sure that it is noble as best you can. Yeah.
And just ask questions, right? Sometimes it's just having the confidence to ask the question.
Oh yeah, and have the confidence. I mean, you can do it. There's no reason why you can't do it. And and I love seeing people of diverse backgrounds. The greatest thing is to walk into a newsroom and have people from all different kinds of backgrounds having conversations about stories. And there's strength in that. And I also just think that it's a rewarding profession if you do it the right way. It really is.
Final question coming from Fiona Conway. How has ABC changed this year, Pierre?
I think that it required us, like all news organizations, to be as creative as we have ever been. And I think I would dare say we have been as busy as we've ever been. If you think about covering the pandemic, you had a presidential election, you had Congress, Senate elections, congressional elections, you had the George Floyd case, a civil rights movement re-energized, the whole issue of whether there would be cyber warfare on the election. Just so many different stories. And I just think that it required the most out of us that I have ever seen. And hopefully we did a good job.
Resources is always an issue, isn't it?
I think resources can be an issue, but this year with the pandemic, I just found that whatever we decided that we were going to invest time and energy to cover, somehow the resources were there to do it. And maybe that's just born out of crisis. That, I always say crisis either brings out the best in people or the worst in people. And what I saw, not just at ABC News, but in most, news organizations, was, I saw people trying to do the best they could in the most challenging of circumstances. I really believe that's so.
Okay. Well, thank you, Pierre. We really do appreciate your time here. And I think I've gone through all of the questions that we've received here. Yeah. Well, there's one question here coming in about the New York Times reporting about Donald Trump. Can I ask you this question?
Sure. What's the question?
Do you have any comments on the New York Times report today that the Trump Justice Department seized phone records from the Washington Post and CNN from 2017? I guess it's it's just the legalities between politicians and the media.
Let me take off my hat of ABC News for a second and put on my hat as a member of the Reporters Committee for the Freedom of the Press. I'm a past chairman of that organization. So my comments about that are from that platform. Look, we press for transparency, and we push back against the notion of, forcing journalists to reveal their sourcing. A free and robust press, we believe at the Reporters Committee, and I think all journalists agree, is important to democracy. And, yes, the government has its standpoint of like, we can't have state secrets being revealed, but we have a job to do, and we should be allowed to do it as aggressively and as vigorously as we can.
It's inspiring words, and this has been an inspiring hour. We appreciate all of your insights. Thank you so much, Pierre Thomas, for sharing your stories with us and answering our questions. Pierre Thomas, the Chief Justice Correspondent with ABC News. It was really great to see you virtually, at least.
Next time in person, it'd be great to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Up next in today's conference, my colleague Gurdeep Ahluwalia will have our next session. It's the rise of the TV doctors. Standing by, we have three doctors who we've all come to know during this past year. They're going to turn the tables and tell us, among other things, what they think of our work during this pandemic. And we've also been thanking our sponsors during this day. We want to say a special thank you to CNN News Source, who are longtime supporters of RTDNA Canada. Thank you very much to CNN News Source. And while we reset for our next panel, a quick word now for more of this year's Lifetime Achievement Award winners, this group from the RTDNA West region.